Trump tariffs ignite a trade conflict with devastating effects. When President Donald Trump decided to slap tariffs on Canadian imports as part of his strategy to bolster the American economy, he likely didn't anticipate the immediate and severe fallout that would follow. His administration targeted the Canadian auto industry, a critical sector deeply intertwined with the U.S. economy, believing that such measures would protect domestic jobs and industries under his America First banner. However, the consequences were swift and brutal, particularly in Canada, where one of the most significant casualties was the Windsor car assembly plant. This facility, a cornerstone of Canadian manufacturing and one of the largest of its kind in the country, was forced to halt operations for at least 2 weeks due to the sudden economic pressure from the tariffs. The shutdown wasn't a gradual wind down but an abrupt stop, leaving 3,600 workers, people who had gone to bed with the security of employment, waking up to a stark new reality. They were jobless, with no clear explanation or warning. These were not just numbers on a spreadsheet, but individuals who started their day with the same optimism as always, only to find their livelihoods yanked away in an instant, a ripple effect of a decision made far away in the White House. The Windsor plant's closure wasn't an isolated incident, but a glaring symbol of how interconnected the U.S. and Canadian economies are, and how quickly a policy aimed at protecting one nation's interests can wreak havoc on its neighbor. Trump's tariffs were intended to shield American workers by making foreign goods less competitive, but the reality on the ground told a different story. For those 3,600 Canadian employees, the impact was personal and immediate. Uncertainty loomed over their futures, with bills to pay and families to support, all disrupted by a trade policy they had no hand in crafting. The decision to target the auto sector, a vital artery of cross-border commerce, demonstrated a miscalculation of the delicate balance that sustains both nations' prosperity. Rather than fortifying the U.S. economy, the tariffs sent shockwaves northward, shuttering factories and sowing chaos among workers who had little time to brace for the fallout. This move underscored a broader theme of unintended consequences. Trump's administration pitched the tariffs as a defensive wall, a way to reclaim economic dominance and bring jobs back to American soil. Yet, the immediate effect was not a triumph for U.S. workers, but a blow to their Canadian counterparts, whose livelihoods were sacrificed in the name of this experiment. The Windsor shutdown became a stark illustration of how a single afternoon's decision in Washington could upend thousands of lives across the border, setting the stage for a retaliatory spiral that would soon engulf both countries in a trade war neither seemed fully prepared to navigate. Far from strengthening America's position, the tariffs exposed the fragility of its economic ties with Canada, a neighbor whose stability had long been taken for granted. Canada strikes back with calculated retaliation. In response to President Trump's aggressive tariffs, Canada didn't sit quietly or wallow in defeat. Far from it. Under the leadership of Prime Minister Mark Carney, the nation launched a bold and strategic counteroffensive, proving it wouldn't be a passive victim in this escalating trade war. Canada's retaliation began with a hefty 25% tariff slapped on U.S. goods valued at $30 billion, set to take effect on March 4, 2025. This wasn't a blanket attack but a carefully targeted strike, focusing on American cars that failed to meet the standards of the USMCA trade agreement. The move was a clear message. Canada would hit back where it hurt, but it would do so with precision. Unlike the U.S., which cast a wide net with its tariffs, Canada chose not to touch auto parts, a deliberate decision to avoid disrupting the deeply integrated production systems that span the border. By sparing parts, Canada protected the broader manufacturing ecosystem, ensuring that factories on both sides could keep humming along, even as it punished non-compliant U.S. vehicles. But Canada's response didn't stop at cars. The country also imposed tariffs on steel and aluminum products worth $12.6 billion, along with a range of other American goods, amplifying the economic pressure. These measures were designed to sting, targeting key U.S. exports that had long flowed freely into Canada. Steel and aluminum, critical materials for construction and manufacturing, would now cost American producers dearly to sell north of the border, while other consumer goods faced similar barriers. This wasn't reckless lashing out. It was a calculated escalation, a way to mirror the pain inflicted by Trump's policies while showcasing Canada's resolve. Prime Minister Carney made it clear. Canada respected its neighbor but wouldn't tolerate being pummeled by tariffs without a fight. The nation's leaders understood the stakes and wielded their economic leverage with a cool-headed strategy, balancing retaliation with restraint to avoid a total collapse of cross-border trade. This retaliation carried a deeper significance. By focusing on specific sectors like non-compliant cars and heavy industries, Canada demonstrated a nuanced understanding of the trade relationship. It could have gone further, targeting auto parts or Mexico's compliant vehicles. But it didn't, recognizing that such moves would boomerang back and harm its own economy. Instead, the tariffs were a surgical strike, aimed at punishing the U.S. without breaking the shared production backbone. The $30 billion tariff package, effective in just under a year from the video's context, loomed as a deadline for the U.S. to reconsider its approach, while the steel and aluminum duties added immediate weight to Canada's defiance. This wasn't just about economics. It was a statement of sovereignty, a refusal to be bullied by a neighbor that had underestimated Canada's willingness to push back. As tensions mounted, Canada's actions set the stage for a prolonged standoff, one where both nations would feel the consequences of a fractured partnership. Economic chaos unfolds in the U.S. as tariffs backfire. President Trump's tariffs, touted as a shield for the American economy, have instead unleashed a storm of unintended consequences, plunging the nation into economic turmoil. What began as a bid to protect U.S. jobs and industries has morphed into a self-inflicted wound, with prices soaring and stability crumbling. The impact was immediate and stark. Commodity prices shot through the roof, driven by the sudden disruption of trade with Canada, a key supplier of raw materials and energy. Inflation, already a simmering concern, erupted as the cost of everyday goods climbed, squeezing American households. Gasoline, a lifeline for millions, became a glaring example. Prices in places like California spiked to $5.25 per gallon, leaving drivers staring at their fuel gauges and wallets in dismay. This wasn't just a minor inconvenience. It was a tangible sign of a broader unraveling, as the U.S. economy teetered on the edge of a recession that experts warned could strike by the second quarter of 2025. The ripple effects were brutal. U.S. refineries, heavily reliant on Canadian crude oil, saw their operating capacity plummet from 89% to just 71% in a single month, a staggering drop that underscored how dependent America remained on its northern neighbor. Without that steady flow of oil, the energy sector faltered, sending gas prices soaring and threatening supply chains across industries. The tariffs, meant to bolster domestic production, instead exposed vulnerabilities, as American businesses struggled to fill the gap left by disrupted imports. Goldman Sachs analysts painted a grim picture, predicting a potential 0.8% shrink in GDP if the oil shortage persisted, a number that might sound small but translates to billions in lost economic activity. From steel mills to grocery stores, the cost of doing business climbed, with Michigan steel producers, for instance, facing a 22% hike in raw material prices. Consumers felt the pinch too, as vegetables, beef, and other staples grew pricier, turning routine shopping trips into a test of financial endurance. Trump's vision of a fortified economy behind a tariff wall crumbled under the weight of reality. Rather than safeguarding jobs, the policy sparked layoffs and uncertainty, both at home and abroad. The U.S. wasn't just hurting Canada, it was hurting itself, as the interconnected nature of North American trade became painfully clear. Inflation wasn't a distant threat but a present crisis, eroding purchasing power and pushing the nation closer to an economic cliff. The White House had gambled that tariffs would force a reorientation of global trade in America's favor, but instead, they ignited a firestorm of rising costs and dwindling resources. As refineries idled and prices climbed, the U.S. resembled a car stalled on the highway, its driver unsure how to restart the engine. This wasn't the economic renaissance Trump had promised. It was a lesson in how quickly a misstep in trade policy could unravel a nation's prosperity, leaving its citizens to bear the burden of a strategy gone awry. Canada pivots oil exports to Asia, leaving the U.S. in the lurch. For decades, Canada stood as America's steadfast energy ally, a reliable neighbor pumping nearly 60% of the U.S. crude oil needs across the border like clockwork. It was a relationship so ingrained that many Americans saw Canada as the kindly uncle who always showed up with a full tank when times got tough. But that image shattered when Canada, stung by Trump's tariffs, turned its back on the U.S. and redirected its oil to new suitors, China and India. This wasn't a gradual shift but a seismic jolt. Within just 3 weeks, Canada slashed 11.4 million barrels from the U.S. supply, sending tremors through the global energy market. The move wasn't born of spite alone. It was a pragmatic pivot to nations willing to pay premium prices without the baggage of trade wars or political demands. While the U.S. floundered in tariff-fueled chaos, Canada found eager buyers in Asia, rewriting the rules of a partnership Washington had long taken for granted. The catalyst for this shift was the Trans Mountain Expansion Project, a game-changer that unlocked Canada's ability to ship up to 890,000 barrels of oil per day directly to global markets, bypassing U.S. pipelines entirely. No longer tethered to American transport routes, Canada gained the freedom to chart its own course, and it did so with gusto. China and India, hungry for energy to fuel their growing economies, swooped in with lucrative long-term contracts, 325,000 barrels per day for the next 15 years, signed with companies like China CNU. These deals offered Canada not just higher profits, but also a reprieve from the diplomatic tangles that came with supplying the U.S. unlike Washington, which layered trade with conditions and retaliatory threats. Beijing and New Delhi kept it simple: oil for cash, no strings attached. For Canada, it was a chance to flex its muscles on the world stage, emerging as a formidable player in the energy game rather than a junior partner to its southern neighbor. The fallout for the U.S. was immediate and harsh. Losing that 11.4 million barrels didn't just tighten oil supplies, it sent gas prices rocketing and left refineries scrambling. Canada's exit wasn't a petty tantrum. It was a calculated break from a relationship strained by tariffs on everything from steel to fertilizers. The U.S., once smug in its assumption of energy security, now faced a stark reality. Its golden friend had found new allies, leaving America to watch helplessly as tankers sailed east. While Canada inked deals and pocketed higher returns, the U.S. remained mired in a trade war of its own making, its gas stations and industries reeling from the loss. This wasn't just a shift in oil flows. It was a betrayal of trust, a reminder that even the closest allies can turn away when pushed too far. As Canada cozied up to Asia, the U.S. was left to grapple with a future where its energy lifeline had slipped through its fingers, traded for the promise of greener pastures across the Pacific. Canada unleashes a multi-pronged counterattack. When the United States, under President Trump, fired the opening salvo of tariffs, Canada didn't just absorb the blow. It hit back with a fierce, multifaceted retaliation that shook the foundations of their economic relationship. Leading the charge was Ontario, where Premier Doug Ford took a hard line, threatening to sever the province's power exports to the U.S. Northeast, a region that relies on Ontario for about 25% of its energy needs. This wasn't an idle warning but a loaded gun, aimed at the heart of American businesses and households that depend on that electricity to keep lights on and factories running. Ford's readiness to pull the plug delivered, as he put it, with a smile on my face, sent a chilling message. Canada could wield its energy dominance as a weapon, and it wasn't afraid to use it. The prospect of blackouts and surging power costs loomed large, a stark reminder of how deeply intertwined the two nations' grids had become. But Ontario didn't stop at threats. In a bold move, the province scrapped a $100 million contract with Starlink, Elon Musk's satellite internet venture, which had been slated to bring connectivity to rural areas. This wasn't just a financial jab, it was a symbolic slap, cutting ties with a high-profile American company aligned with Trump's policies. Ford didn't mince words, calling out Musk's hypocrisy for turning against a country that had once nurtured him as a student. The cancellation rippled beyond tech, signaling Canada's willingness to sacrifice economic partnerships to defend its interests. Then came the knockout punch from the LCBO, the world's largest liquor distributor, which halted all imports of American booze the moment U.S. tariffs took effect. Overnight, U.S. producers lost a $1 billion market, their bottles gathering dust as Canada flexed its purchasing power to inflict pain on an industry that had thrived on cross-border trade. Canada's arsenal didn't end there. The country eyed another ace up its sleeve: nickel, a critical mineral for U.S. automakers and tech firms. Ontario supplies nearly half of America's nickel, and Ford hinted at tightening exports, a move that could cripple industries reliant on this resource for batteries and manufacturing. This wasn't a haphazard counterstrike but a calculated escalation, layering tariffs, energy threats, and strategic resource plays to maximize leverage. Canada's government rolled out a 25% tariff on $155 billion worth of U.S. goods, with $30 billion kicking in immediately, targeting everything from steel to consumer products. The LCBO's liquor ban and Ontario's moves set a precedent, proving Canada could hit the U.S. where it hurt without blinking. This was retaliation with purpose, a refusal to be cowed by Trump's trade aggression. As tensions flared, Canada's broad counteroffensive revealed a nation ready to fight, not just to survive, but to make the U.S. feel the full weight of its defiance, reshaping a partnership that had once seemed unshakable. Global outrage and public backlash erupt over Trump's tariffs. President Trump's tariff onslaught didn't just spark a trade war with Canada, it ignited a firestorm of condemnation from world leaders and a visceral reaction from everyday people, signaling a deepening rift on the global stage. In Canada, the response was raw and immediate. Citizens didn't just grumble, they took action, boycotting American products with a fervor that emptied shelves of U.S. brands. Trips to the States, once a casual jaunt across the border, were canceled en masse, and at sporting events, a once respectful silence during the U.S. national anthem turned into jeers and boos. This wasn't mere frustration, it was a collective roar of defiance, a nation standing up to say it wouldn't be trampled by a neighbor's reckless policies. The sound of Canadians booing the Star-Spangled Banner echoed beyond stadiums, a haunting symbol of a friendship fraying under the weight of economic aggression. Across the Atlantic and beyond, leaders joined the chorus of disapproval. Ursula von der Leyen, President of the European Commission, spoke with a mix of dismay and resolve, lamenting the U.S. betrayal of decades of cooperation. She made it clear Europe hadn't sought this fight but was ready to shield its people from the fallout, her words carrying the sting of a continent disheartened by America's turn inward. Australia's Prime Minister Anthony Albanese was blunter, calling Trump's tariffs totally unwarranted and a violation of the trust between allies. He warned that this unilateral move threatened a partnership built on mutual benefit, his tone sharp with the frustration of a friend scorned. Closer to home, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney didn't just defend his country's counterstrikes. He predicted a slow bleed for the U.S. economy, one that would drag both nations down but hit America hardest. These weren't empty critiques. They were a united front, projecting a global cost of $1.4 trillion and a staggering $6 trillion burden on U.S. citizens, numbers that painted Trump, Liberation Day, as a catastrophic misadventure. The backlash wasn't confined to podiums and policy papers. Scholars like Professor Scott Lucas tore into Trump's strategy, branding it economically illiterate and a masterclass in self-sabotage. Even conservatives balked. Former Australian PM John Howard decried tariffs as a proven failure that inflated prices without saving jobs, while U.S. Senator Rand Paul warned of political ruin, citing historical precedents where tariffs tanked parties at the polls. Together, these voices painted a damning picture. Trump's gamble was unraveling the global economy, alienating allies and saddling Americans with higher costs. From Canadian arenas to European capitals, the reaction was unanimous: anger, resolve, and a refusal to let Trump's policies go unchallenged. This wasn't just about trade. It was a reckoning, a world pushing back against a leader whose tariff wall threatened to collapse under its own weight, leaving the U.S. isolated and its people paying the price. America's energy dependence on Canada laid bare. For years, President Trump boasted that the United States had achieved energy independence, a shining badge of honor waved at rallies and press conferences. He once declared America free from needing Canada's resources, painting a picture of a self-sufficient powerhouse unshackled from foreign ties. But when Canada pulled the plug on its oil, gas, and electricity exports in retaliation to Trump's tariffs, that bravado crumbled, exposing a harsh truth. The U.S. wasn't the standalone titan it claimed to be. Far from it. America still leaned heavily on its northern neighbor, importing a staggering 4.42 million barrels of oil daily, accounting for 60% of its total oil imports. This wasn't just a convenience. It was a necessity, driven by the unique fit of Canada's heavy crude with U.S. refineries, which struggled to process the lighter domestic stuff. Without that steady flow, the U.S. faced a scramble, turned to pricier, less stable Middle Eastern oil or watch its energy system falter, a choice that mocked Trump's narrative of autonomy. The reliance didn't end with oil. Canada pumped 8.5 billion cubic feet of natural gas into the U.S. each day, a lifeline for northern states like New York and Michigan, where it fueled power plants and kept homes warm through brutal winters. If Canada cut that supply, gas prices would soar and blackouts could ripple across the grid, leaving millions in the cold, literally and figuratively. Then there was electricity, an often overlooked thread in this energy tapestry. Provinces like Quebec and Ontario exported billions of kilowatt-hours annually, stabilizing power grids in states from New England to the Midwest. A sudden halt wouldn't just hike bills. It could cripple industries and plunge households into darkness, a vulnerability that turned energy into a national security issue, not just an economic one. Trump's push to revive the Keystone XL pipeline only underscored the irony. He'd fought to lock in Canadian oil even as he claimed the U.S. didn't need it, a contradiction laid bare when Canada turned elsewhere. This dependence wasn't a secret to those in the know, but Canada's retaliation ripped the veil off for everyone else. The U.S. couldn't flip a switch and replace 4.42 million barrels of oil overnight. Domestic production, while growing, lacked the scale and infrastructure to fill the gap short-term. Natural gas and electricity were no different. Canada's proximity and reliability made it irreplaceable, a fact Trump's tariffs ignored at America's peril. As gas stations charged more, refineries idled, and power bills loomed larger, the myth of energy independence dissolved. The U.S. wasn't a fortress. It was a tenant, reliant on a landlord who just raised the rent. Canada's move didn't just hurt. It humiliated, proving that Trump's chest-thumping couldn't erase the reality of a nation still tethered to its neighbors' resources, vulnerable to every twist in this trade war's unraveling saga. U.S. consumers and businesses reel from tariff fallout. President Trump's tariffs were sold as a lifeline for American industry, a bold stroke to bring prosperity back home. But as the trade war with Canada escalated, that promise unraveled, leaving U.S. consumers and businesses to shoulder a crushing burden. The fallout hit hard and fast. Gas prices skyrocketed, with pumps in California flashing $5.25 per gallon, a number that turned filling up into a gut punch for drivers already stretched thin. It wasn't just fuel. Steel mills in Michigan saw raw material costs spike by 22%, a jolt that rippled through manufacturing, jacking up prices for everything from cars to appliances. At the grocery store, the pain deepened. Vegetables and beef crept out of reach for many, as import disruptions and retaliatory tariffs drove food costs into a relentless climb. This wasn't a temporary blip. It was a tsunami of inflation, drowning households in a sea of rising expenses with no lifeboat in sight. Businesses, too, staggered under the weight. Car prices in the U.S. were poised to leap by $1,000 to $3,000, not because of some global crisis, but because Trump's tariffs had snarled the supply chains feeding Detroit and beyond. Canadian steel and aluminum, once a steady flow, now came with a steep premium, forcing manufacturers to either eat the cost or pass it on, a lose-lose scenario that threatened their bottom lines. The stock market mirrored the chaos, with the Dow Jones plunging 900 points in a single day, its worst drop in over 2 years, followed by a 1,000-point futures slide after Trump Liberation Day speech. Investors weren't just spooked. They were sounding the alarm on an economy teetering on the brink, battered by a policy that promised protection but delivered pandemonium. Refineries, running at a meager 71% capacity after Canada's oil cuts, couldn't keep up, leaving energy-dependent industries gasping for air. For the average American, this was more than statistics. It was a daily grind turned grueling. A trip to the pump now meant choosing between gas and groceries. A new car became a pipe dream as sticker prices soared. Small businesses, already razor-thin on margins, faced a stark choice: raise prices and risk losing customers, or cut back and shed jobs. Trump's tariffs had aimed to shield the heartland, but instead, they stabbed it, driving up the cost of living and eroding the stability of the very people he'd vowed to champion. The stock market's nosedive wasn't just Wall Street's problem. It signaled a broader unraveling, a loss of faith in a strategy that had backfired spectacularly. As Canada retaliated and global markets quaked, U.S. consumers and companies found themselves not empowered, but ensnared, caught in a trade war where the casualties weren't just trade balances, but the livelihoods and dreams of millions. This was the real cost of America First, a nation paying dearly for a gamble that left its own people holding the bill. Trump's tariff strategy faces fierce criticism from all sides. When President Trump rolled out his tariff plan, he framed it as a stroke of genius, a way to protect American jobs and muscle the U.S. back to economic supremacy. But as the fallout unfolded, a chorus of critics, from scholars to politicians across the ideological spectrum, tore into the policy with a ferocity that left little room for doubt. This was a blunder of historic proportions. Professor Scott Lucas didn't hold back, calling Trump's trade speech the dumbest, most economically illiterate he'd ever heard, a scathing verdict from an academic who'd seen plenty of policy flops. Lucas argued that the tariffs weren't just misguided. They were a wrecking ball, smashing through decades of economic wisdom to leave a trail of inflated prices and lost opportunities. His wasn't a lone voice. Experts modeled a grim future, with U.S. tariffs peaking at 29%, the highest since the Great Depression, promising a $1.4 trillion hit to the global economy and a $6 trillion burden on American taxpayers. Even conservatives, typically Trump's staunchest allies, couldn't stomach the mess. Former Australian Prime Minister John Howard, a veteran of free market battles, dismissed tariffs as a relic of folly he'd rejected 20 years ago. They don't protect jobs, he warned. They just jack up prices. a blunt rebuke from a leader who'd watched protectionism fail time and again. Across the Pacific, U.S. Senator Rand Paul, a Republican with a libertarian streak, piled on, pointing to history's harsh lessons. He cited the 1890 McKinley Tariffs, which cost the GOP half its seats, and the 1930s Smoot-Hawley debacle, which sank the party for decades. They're not just bad economically, Paul cautioned. They're political poison. His words carried weight, an elected official from Trump's own party, sounding the alarm that this tariff spree could torch both the economy and the GOP's future. Together, these voices painted a damning picture. Trump's plan wasn't a lifeline, but a noose tightening around America's neck. The criticism wasn't just about numbers. It was personal, aimed at a president who'd alienated allies and ignored evidence. Howard called Trump's stance toward nations like Canada blameworthy, a betrayal of friendships forged over generations. Lucas mocked the hubris of a leader who thought he could outsmart global trade with a sledgehammer, while Paul warned of electoral doom, a specter that loomed as voters felt the sting of rising costs. This wasn't partisan sniping. It was a rare consensus, bridging borders and ideologies to slam a policy that defied logic. As Canada redirected oil and slapped counter-tariffs, the critiques rang truer. Trump's tariffs weren't strengthening America but isolating it, hiking prices without delivering jobs, and risking a political reckoning. From classrooms to capitals, the verdict was clear. This was a self-inflicted wound, a strategy so flawed it united critics in a shared cry of disbelief, leaving Trump's trade war legacy teetering on the edge of disaster. Trade tensions threatened to cripple the U.S. automotive industry. President Trump's tariff war didn't just strain ties with Canada. It put the U.S. automotive sector, a cornerstone of American manufacturing, on a collision course with disaster. The America First policy, meant to shield domestic industries, instead slammed the brakes on a system that thrives on cross-border cooperation, sending shockwaves through Detroit, Ohio, and Kentucky, hubs where cars are born from an intricate dance of parts and labor. Canada and Mexico, vital cogs in this machine, supply everything from engines and transmissions to raw steel and aluminum, seamlessly feeding U.S. assembly lines. But when Trump's tariffs hit, that flow stuttered, threatening to jack up car prices by $1,000 to $3,000, not because of a global meltdown, but because of a self-imposed trade barrier. This wasn't protection. It was sabotage, a reckless gamble that could stall an industry already racing to stay competitive in a global market. The stakes were dizzying. Millions of U.S.-made vehicles rely on Canadian steel and Mexican components, a partnership honed over decades to keep costs down and production humming. Trump's tariffs, 25% on Canadian goods, with retaliatory strikes from both neighbors, snarled this lifeline, hiking the price of raw materials and parts. Manufacturers faced a brutal choice: absorb the hit and bleed profits, or pass it on and watch buyers balk at showroom stickers. Canada's counter-tariffs on $155 billion in U.S. goods, including autos, only tightened the vice, while Mexico loomed as a wild card, ready to retaliate if pushed. The result? A potential collapse of the supply chain that's kept American carmakers afloat, with no quick fix in sight. Shifting production stateside sounded patriotic, but the reality was grim. Labor costs here dwarf those in Mexico. Environmental rules add layers of expense, and the U.S. lacks the steel, aluminum, and rare minerals to go it alone. Rebuilding that capacity, a 5 to 10-year slog costing billions, far too slow to dodge the chaos unfolding now. For American workers and consumers, this was a double whammy. Factory jobs, the very ones Trump vowed to save, teetered as rising costs forced cutbacks, fewer shifts, fewer hires, maybe even layoffs. Meanwhile, the average buyer faced a new car market turning unaffordable, a dream deferred by a policy that promised prosperity but delivered sticker shock. The global market didn't sit still either. As U.S. costs climbed, foreign rivals like Japan and Germany could swoop in, undercutting American brands with cheaper alternatives. This wasn't just an economic hiccup, it was a structural threat, a trade war shaking the automotive industry's foundations. Trump's tariff wall, built to fortify, instead risked toppling a sector that employs millions, leaving workers, businesses, and drivers to navigate the wreckage. As Canada and Mexico dug in, the question loomed. Would America first end up putting its own car industry last, a casualty of a fight it couldn't win?